Hey everyone, welcome to the first episode of my podcast, Planted for Purpose podcast. And my name is Fikayo and I will be your host. I've been wanting to start this podcast for quite some time now. And the aim of this podcast is just to discuss about life in general and the challenges that come with that, but also trying to navigate my purpose within these challenges. And I'm just really excited to start this journey with all of you. Let's dive into a topic that I think is quite foundational and I think will set the premise of this entire podcast. And it's a topic that I feel affects who we are, how we see ourselves, how we relate with other people, and even our relationship with God as well. And that topic is identity. In our generation nowadays, identity is such a big deal within social media, just amongst our peers and everyone. And we are very much focused on labels and being able to categorize ourselves and put ourselves in certain boxes and just kind of figuring out who we are and what our purpose is in life. And I just wanted to discuss that, dive into that, and how we can go about finding who we are and finding our purpose in life. I don't know about any of you, but I've definitely gone through seasons. I would even say that I'm currently in a season where I am questioning my identity, trying to figure out who I am, where I'm supposed to be, what I'm supposed to be doing, especially because I recently graduated about 1 or 2 years ago and I just started my job. And I'm from the UK, as you can probably tell from my accent. And during the UK, you go through the educational system. So we go from primary school to secondary, A level/college, then university. And then straight after university, you graduate and you're just expected to find a graduate job. With that, with going through the education system, you always know what's next. You always know the next call of action, the plans that come after each one. You just know you're supposed to study hard and you just go to the next level, get to the next class. Things are just kind of set out for us. We're told what to do and we're told how to do it. But as soon as you finish and as soon as you leave the educational system, you no longer have that guiding hand anymore. There's no, line or any book that necessarily can show us what we're supposed to do next, what we're supposed to do with our lives, what we're supposed to aim for. And that can be quite daunting. I know that it's been especially daunting for me and it's caused a lot of confusion, anxiety, and this feeling of being left behind or maybe not doing enough, feeling like, should I buy a house now? Should I not buy a house? Should I be looking to start a new job? Is this a career I want to go on for the rest of my life? And it just becomes a hard task to navigate that through by myself. I have found different ways that I've been trying to define my identity by, and that could be by the title, my job title, success, my relationship with others, and even more. But the problem with all these things that I've started to figure out is that they are temporary, and when these things go, we're back to the start of everything. We're back to confusion. We're back to not knowing who we are. I feel like I was definitely wearing labels that other people have put on me or what is expected of me in this world. And I feel like I started to define and try and define myself and my identity by my success, my title, my relationships with others. And the problem with all of these things is that they are temporary, they shift, they move on, and ultimately they're not reliable, they're not stable. And what happens when they're gone is that the cycle begins all over again, where we question ourselves, question who we're supposed to be, question where we're supposed to be going. And that's what I want to dive into today. There was an analogy that I came across from reading this book called The Purpose Driven Life. It's a very good book and I'll 100% definitely recommend reading this. But the analogy stated that let's say you buy a new appliance, whether it's today or tomorrow, you bought a new appliance and you're not too entirely sure about how this appliance works or what it's used for. So what would you do in that situation? You're not going to ask the appliance, how do you work? Obviously not, because it didn't create itself. But what we will do is perhaps read its manufacturer guide that came with the appliance, or perhaps call the manufacturers, ask them how it works, or what we should be doing next. And I felt like this analogy is such a good one because it definitely relates to us, especially if you're a Christian, as I am a Christian, and basically this podcast is going to be led by faith, and that's what I'm going to refer to. And as a Christian, we have our own manufacturer. I believe that we have our own manufacturing guide and we also have our own manufacturer. We didn't create ourselves. What's our manufacturing guide? That's the word, the Bible. And it's something that we have easy access to. And It's just everywhere. And we can always relate back to that to guide us. And then who's our manufacturer? How can we access our manufacturer? Just by prayer, just praying and just asking God, first of all, who we are, what we're supposed to be doing, what our purpose is. And I just believe that these are two first steps that we have in trying to figure out what our identity is, what our purpose is. And if we're not doing these steps, we'll constantly be thrown into a world of confusion of trying to figure out, should I do this or should I do that? So today I just want to talk about what it means to root our identity in Christ, and not about what we say or what people say about us, but about what God says about us. So let's start here. So Genesis 1 verse 27. This says, so God created man in his own image. The image of God he created him, male and female, he created them. So that's our beginning. We are created in God's image. So that means that there's something that's sacred and intentional about our design. We weren't created by accident. We weren't created by leftovers. We weren't created as an afterthought. We were created in the image of God. And if we believe God is perfection, then that means we were also created in our own perfection. That means there's a purpose behind our creation. Here's where the problem lies. The problem is that the world tells us otherwise. The world tells us that we are not enough, that there's something wrong, there's something to be fixed. The world tells us that everything about us needs to be earned. Our worth has to be earned. Our beauty has to be earned. Our purpose has to be earned. And we have to constantly be fighting for it. We have to constantly try and prove ourselves, constantly have to buy our way through it as well. As the Bible has already told us that we have already been made in perfection, there's nothing more that we have to do. And this is why the gospel is such good news. 2 Corinthians 5 verse 17 says, therefore, if anyone's in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. So how do we interpret this as what does this mean for us? First, right here, this is not just a maybe. This is not a possibility. This is a promise that's been made. This verse tells us is that one, our past doesn't define us. What other people say don't define us either. Even our past achievements, whatever we used to think defined us before, no longer defines us. We have a new identity, and that identity is now in Christ. So all of these things that we attach our value to and our worth to no longer matter. What defines us now is Christ. None of these worldly aspects, none of our own insecurities, not what other people say, none of our doubts as well. And that's the great thing about it. We can just let go. We can let go of all of these insecurities. We can let go of what we thought defined us in the past and accept this new identity that has already been given to us. So let me ask you a question. And I just want everyone to think about it, because I have to think about it. And it's quite a scary question to ask. But if you were to be stripped of everything gone, who would you say that you are? Who would you be? So if you had no job title, if that relationship status that you're holding on to, you no longer had it, if that money that you had in your bank account was gone, if that beauty that relates to the standards of the world, if you no longer conform to it, who would you be? What are you defined by? I often find myself having to sit down and think about that as well. Because I have been told that who I am in terms of my job, in terms of those who are around me, in terms of the status I have in this world. But we have to remember that that's not what we're defined. That's not how God defines us. That's not how God sees us. And I feel like as a society, we have opted to rule ourselves as one thing. We are so big on labels, and we're opted to stick into these certain labels, even if those labels that we define ourselves as aren't quite negative. For example, some of us are happy to define ourselves as liars, adulterers, cheaters, thieves. We're happy to stick to these labels. We just say, this is how we are. This is who we are. This is how I was born as. We say that our trauma defines us and there's no way to get back. We like to stay within this victim mentality of my trauma defined me and that's how I'm going to remain for the rest of my life. We end up navigating the entirety of our lives and based on the entirety of our lives on these things that we've based ourselves on. But the problem is who we think we are is different to what God has already designed us to be. Who you think you are now is not the full picture. God has already painted that picture. He knows what we look like. He knows who we really are. So why do we like to stay within these bubbles? Do we like to confine ourselves within these boxes and limit ourselves to all these possibilities that are available to us? This reminds me of the book of Ruth as well. In the beginning of Ruth, we have Naomi. Naomi has lost her entire family. Both her sons and her husband have passed away at this point in the beginning of Ruth. So obviously Naomi is stricken with grief, and who would it be? You lose everyone, you lose your children, you lose your husband, you lose your family. So she's stricken with grief, she sees no hope. And guess what Naomi does in that instant? Naomi changes her name. When she goes back home and goes back to her people and they call her Naomi, she says, "Don't call me that." She labels herself a different name and she names herself Mara, which we're told in the Bible means bitterness. Naomi labels herself as bitter. She labels her life, her destiny as bitterness. And the reason why this part of the scripture really caught my attention was because I realized this is what I tend to do as well. I go through periods of confusion and loss, and I'm ready to label myself as confused and lost. I'm ready to accept that as my final destination. I have no other destination apart from that. And that's what Naomi does at the beginning. But then when you read the entirety of Ruth, we see her destiny is completely changed through Ruth herself. God already had a plan for her, but she was so quick to accept her life and her destiny as bitterness. She changed her name and labeled herself as such. And that's what we do as well. But then from that story, it tells us that it's not the complete, that's not the end. There's more to come and there's a purpose for everything, even within our grief, within our sorrow, within the hard times. So the second step, I would say, about figuring out our identity and figuring out our purpose is to stop defining ourselves by what we think is right, but rather define ourselves by what is possible. By going first to God, confirming with Him and obeying Him in that aspect. Where we are right now is not the end. It's just the beginning. And that's where faith is. Having faith that where we are now is not the end, but rather the beginning of what is to come. And then talk of identity, something I like to refer to is Matthew 3:17. So in Matthew 3:17, right after Jesus comes up from the water, a voice from heaven says, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." Now, this is before Jesus has performed any public miracles. This is before he's preached any sermons. This is before he's healed countless of people. This is before he feeds 5,000s and 4,000s. This is before anything. This is before his journey and his activity. And yet, God comes out and says that he's pleased with Jesus, despite him not performing any miracles, performing anything that we know of yet. This tells me that God doesn't love us more when we perform more, nor does he love us less if we mess up. Our identity in Christ is already secured. And our identity doesn't come from what we do and how often we do certain things. That has already been painted. God was pleased with Jesus because God knew where Jesus was already headed. God knew what Jesus was made for. And because Jesus was already just showing signs of obedience, that was enough for God to be pleased. And that's what I feel is the same for us. We may not necessarily know what we're supposed to do right now. Maybe the instructions haven't been made clear to us as of right now. But rather than spiraling and trying to figure out ourselves, trying to create next steps for ourselves, we have to sit down and just walk in his obedience now. Hear what we already have been told and walk in that. And God will be pleased with us because our identity is already secured. The perfection that we seek, we have to remember, doesn't come from our manufacturer. And that's the thing. The reason why the world will tell us that we're not enough, the reason why the world tells us that we haven't reached our level of perfection is because the world doesn't necessarily understand how we work. Our manufacturer does, our creator does. He knows where we are, he knows where we're headed to. And those around you can't necessarily see that. So they see an unfinished painting. And sometimes we see ourselves. We see something that's unfinished, but in the eyes of God, we're already finished. And so long as we walk in that obedience into what he's already told us in the moment, we're already headed towards that completion. And that's where our identity should lay in. Identity should lay into what God has already in store for us rather than what's happening to us currently. Our identity lays in the future that we have rather than our past and rather than even our present at times. And this whole discussion just kind of reminds me of 1 Samuel about King Saul. God had already planned the kingship for Saul. God already has set him out. He had already created his purpose and his identity. However, Saul didn't trust. Number one, Saul didn't have enough faith. He still feared the future. He feared what was to happen. And number two, he had no patience. He also had arrogance and he was disobedient. And because of his disobedience and his impatience, the Lord left Saul and his entire life and his entire destiny was ruined. His purpose was not fulfilled. Then this is something we should relate to ourselves as well. Number one, we got to be obedient and we have to be patient. I think what I'm just trying to say from today, if you hear anything or just catch anything from what I've just been talking about today, is that we don't necessarily have to hustle for the identity that we're seeking. It's not something that we have to earn. It's already something that's given to us. It's something that if we accept Christ, we have already been made new. We already have an identity that's put upon us. We don't have to hustle for a seat at God's table. We already have a seat, as long as we accept and we're obedient to the rules that have been applied to us. So what we need to genuinely question isn't about whether we've earned our identity or whether we already have an identity. The question is learning how to live with the identity that we have been given already. It's not about who we are, it's about what we do with who we are. What is the next step after that? So we're not trying to earn our identity, we're not trying to impress God, but we're rather trying to walk in obedience into that, in the identity that He's given to us already, to carry it as a badge of honor, to make Him proud with it, and allowing it to transform our lives and allowing other people to see us and identify us as such. This will in turn transform the way we see ourselves and also transform the way that we see other people, treat them with compassion and love, because we are so certain and rooted in our identity in Christ. We learn to serve and we're more humble. And the beautiful thing about allowing your identity to be rooted in Christ is when you know who you are in Christ and you root your identity in Christ, you no longer have to prove yourself. You no longer have to go through the exhausting task of trying to earn perfection, this unrealistic perfection set by worldly standards. You no longer have to prove yourself. You can love yourself boldly. You can love others boldly. You can forgive yourself. You can stand firm in face of shaky circumstances because you no longer put the foundation of your identity on temporary things. You now put your identity in Christ and He becomes your foundation. And we know that foundation is stable. It never changes. God is the same yesterday, tomorrow, and today. There's no change with that. And I think it's honestly freeing to see yourself as that, to stop comparing yourself, to stop questioning yourself, and just live boldly in who God has already called us to be, and just learning how to live with that steps and living in obedience with that. So I think I'm just going to spend most of this week just in prayer and constantly trying to remind myself about who God has said I am and who He wants me to be, and just kind of reminding myself, because it's so easy to forget, it's so easy to be distracted by what's going on, distracted by what's on the media, or distracted by what other people are telling us. And that's why it's important to always go back, to always confirm, to always get that reassurance again and again and again. And that reassurance will always be there because it will never change. You'll forever be rooted in Christ. And because this isn't just about the knowledge, it's about transformation and just being fully transformed in Christ. But I think that's it for me today for the first episode. I really hope I've been able to reach someone or somebody else can relate to what I'm saying and perhaps viewing things quite differently or viewing their identity quite differently. And that would really make me happy. I think this was good first episode. I think it's been quite short. Hopefully, as I get used to speaking to a camera, get used to speaking in a microphone, my podcast will be much longer and more insightful as well. But if you genuinely enjoyed the first episode, there's more to come. I promise that. There'll 100% be more to come, more insights, more things to navigate. Life hasn't ended. And there's so many things to discuss and just actually reflect on. And if you genuinely enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to share it with friends, family, somebody close to you, and just tune in, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and also follow me on Spotify, Apple Music when I upload the audio version on those platforms. But I hope to see you again next week. Thank you. Bye.